Hi, I'm Gary, and this is episode 202 of EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. On the show today, we'll be looking at the little lies, mistruths, and incomplete info that happens when companies engage in the act of paltering. This season of the podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the free-to-download app that helps EV drivers search, plan, and pay for their charging. Before we start, I wanted to let you know that we've got a packed season ahead of us. We'll be talking about climate, education, car dealerships, home chargers, and greening up the film set. So if you're not subscribed, make sure you do that so you won't miss anything. If you're driving or out jogging at the moment, why not make a mental note to subscribe when you get to a place where you can do so without any problems. Our main topic of discussion today is paltering. Paltering is the active use of selective truthful statements to mislead. This is something used a lot in numerous situations when you want to make a point. You see it all the time. If a parent asks their teenager, "Have you done your homework?" and the teenager replies, "Yes, I finished the assigned work," this could mean they've actually put effort into completing the work appropriately, or it could mean they've done the absolute bare minimum, such as writing "don't know" against the answers. Strictly speaking, what they're saying is truthful, but in reality, it's misleading. When we're talking about something happening at the level of a child trying to fool their parents into letting them onto the PlayStation, that's one thing. When we're looking at some of the bigger issues facing society today, it becomes something completely different. The issue with a lot of these things is that it's easy to misunderstand the impact. Sure, we could say that renewables won't work because when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, there's no power. But that prejudices people against the cheapest form of energy due to a misunderstanding about what renewable means. So today we're talking about paltering, what it is, and what are examples of it. To help me today, I'd like to welcome back Liz Allan from Full Circle Continuous Improvement. Liz was a guest in episode 185 last season when we discussed her move to electric and how she dealt with the concerns she had about doing that. And today she's here to talk paltering with me. Welcome, Liz. What I want to do is to bring up some specific paltering that's prevalent in the media and have a bit of a discussion about each of these and why it's a problem. But first, can you talk to me a little bit more about what paltering is and isn't?
So paltering's a really interesting scenario that people don't recognise this word. You introduced me to it a few weeks ago, didn't you? A few months ago. And I didn't actually understand it, but the actual definition. So this was introduced in 2016 by Harvard University and the University of Pennsylvania, and it refers to the active use of true statements to create an overall false impression. It's known as lying by telling the truth.
Bizarre concept, isn't it?
And actually, once we start talking about this, your listeners are going to totally recognize where this comes from, and they'll be able to identify where they see this and where they hear it. Because once it opens your mind to it, it just totally blew my mind. And I just thought, that's what this thing is. But it's quite difficult, isn't it, for people to understand? So lying by telling the truth. So shall I kind of move on and actually give some example, or just talk about what this is kind of meaning?
Yep, if you wouldn't mind, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
So paltering, there's different options to paltering. Lovely to know. So the first one is lying by commission, which is the active use of false statements to create a false impression. The second one is lying by omission, and that's the passive avoidance of true statements to create a false impression. So, and there are so many options that we could talk through on this, isn't there, Gary?
The study Liz mentioned by Richard Zeckhauser, the Frank Plumpton Ramsey Professor of Political Economy at Harvard, and Frederick Schauer is about paltering, and it states that a lie involves three elements: deceptive intent, an inaccurate message, and a harmful effect. When only one or two of these elements is present, we don't call the activity lying, even when the practice is no less morally questionable or socially detrimental. Liz talked about the different aspects of lying which apply to paltering. One of the biggest culprits when it comes to paltering is the fossil fuel industry.
So, just to point out one specific, and this is an American fossil fuel company, ExxonMobil, they ran an advert in the New York Times. And the advert said, a number of climate experts agree that carbon capture and storage is crucial to reducing emissions to combat climate change. That's why ExxonMobil is working to deploy this technology at scale for the highest emitting sectors. It can remove more than 90% of CO2 emissions from carbon-intensive industries, which can help lower the carbon footprint of many everyday things like roads we drive on and devices we rely on. Learn how ExxonMobil is advancing climate solutions like carbon capture and storage. That is one example.
I never thought I'd have an ExxonMobil ad on my podcast.
Sorry about that.
So, do you want to explain what it is about the wording in that is the lying by telling the truth aspect?
So the ad itself is claiming that it's advancing climate solutions by investing in carbon capture technology. And actually, yes, technically they are. And carbon capture technology is a climate solution, but the actual truth is selective, because overall they're doing far much more to increase climate, the climate crisis than solving it. And they're still refusing to slow down the fossil fuel production. So it's actually probably similar to the UK, and other fossil fuel companies are actually expanding oil and gas production. So that is the paltering aspect of that advert.
Right. Let's go through a few examples that have come across my desk. The first one is, hydrogen cars refill in 2 minutes and do 400 miles to a tank. The implication is that they're analogous to petrol cars, therefore a better use case for moving forward in a zero emissions future than battery electric. What they're missing is the fact that it's an overly expensive solution, there's no infrastructure for it, and the cars are also expensive. It also assumes you can find a working hydrogen station with no queue, that the tank is fully pressurized and you don't have to wait for that you can unhook the connector after you've filled it up, as it may have frozen to your car. And that range figure is quite often vastly overstated.
Well, so funnily enough, I wrote a newsletter yesterday, and it was around something completely different. It was about dealerships and home EV charging. And somebody who wasn't connected to me actually put on one of the posts, hydrogen-powered vehicles are the future, not EV, unfortunately. So a very kind David Watts, who is a part of a group that I'm in, actually put a response to that, which I thought was he's very, very good at putting a very measured response on hydrogen. So it's kind of, again, what I would say is this is how people think hydrogen and moving forward is hydrogen, with hydrogen is the be all and end all. But do you want me to quote some of what David said?
Please do, yes.
Hydrogen may become part of the solution for specific challenging vehicle use cases, such as long-distance HGVs or coaches, and maybe even heavy-duty 3.5-ton LCVs. But in reality, battery electric is a better solution for the majority of road vehicles, particularly cars. Important to recognise that hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are just EVs that use H2 to create the electricity to power the vehicle. H2 may be good for air quality, but in order for H2 to be clean, and I find this is the important bit that people don't realise, you need green hydrogen, i.e. H2 that's been created using renewable energy. And that is, obviously, we hear a lot about fossil fuel companies pushing forward, or have heard it, pushing forward with hydrogen, but actually it's more likely than not to not be green because it won't be created using renewable energy. So what he said here, green H2 is significantly more expensive than grey H2. And grey H2 accounts for around 95% of all H2 in the UK today.
As a side note, I personally don't see much of a market for hydrogen in road transport anywhere, but there might be some very minor edge cases where this happens. But moving on. Liz, what's your stance on nuclear energy?
I'm a little bit on the fence, Gary, when it comes to nuclear. I've talked to my husband about it, and he sees it as something that we do need out of as part of the mix. But for me, I still feel a little bit on the fence, maybe because I don't know enough about it.
Well, that brings me nicely onto another aspect of paltering, which is usually propagated by anti-nuclear types, usually to slow down the adoption of nuclear energy. Now, don't get me wrong, there are many reasons why we should be considering other renewables in place of nuclear right now, but this isn't one of them. Nuclear power is dangerous due to the large amount of waste it produces. Now, the kernel of truth in here is that there is a lot of waste produced and it's radioactive, except that of all the nuclear waste, only about 5% is the nasty, dangerous stuff that we can't find a solution for, the bit from the middle of the reactor itself. The vast majority is low-level waste, such as papers, rags, tools, clothing, filters, and other materials which contain small amounts of mostly short-lived radioactivity. But if you neglect to state that, it becomes really easy to build a false picture of the radioactive impact of these huge amounts of waste. While we're on the nuclear theme, let's stay with the golden oldie that I particularly like. Nuclear accidents are deadly to large proportions of the population. Now, this is another key paltering fact that relies on misinformation. Yes, a nuclear accident can be deadly. The potential is immense. But across all the big nuclear accidents that have occurred, so we're talking 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, in the period between 1970 and 1992, there were a total of 39 on-the-job deaths of nuclear power plant workers worldwide. If you include secondary deaths from cancer due to radiation, that number rises to a little under 5,000. In that same time period, there were 6,400 on-the-job deaths of coal power plant workers, 1,200 on-the-job deaths of natural gas power plant workers and members of the general public caused by natural gas power plants, and 4,000 deaths of members of the general public caused by hydroelectric power plants, with the failure in Bangayo Dam in 1975 resulting in an astonishing 170,000 fatalities alone. That's not to say that hydroelectric is not safe, but again, if there's an issue, it can be dangerous, more dangerous than nuclear. So let's talk about cobalt. The famous thing I hear all the time is EVs use cobalt mined using child slave labour. Liz, talk to us about cobalt.
I've spoken to, and I know we both know Dr. Ewan McTurk, and I've spoken to him about this. And actually, so child labour was something that was quite prolific in the DRC. So there's previously, well, there are still problems with child labour in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the majority of cobalt comes from open cast mines run by big mining giants. There's one that I know Ewan was talking about called Glencore, and they've actually got strict rules now in place about safety and the age of somebody who would be working there. And actually, all the big companies like this are now looking after their employees and making sure that through international standards, there's a standard there to manage the fact that, that this was happening and it theoretically shouldn't be happening anymore. So what Ewan was talking about was that there are some smaller, he called it artisanal mines. He said that actually do have child labour there. So a small proportion of artisanal mines do use child labour, which he agreed, and I agree, obviously, still needs to be stamped out.
Absolutely.
But he also pointed out that lots of, there's a company called Fairphone, and he was saying that they've introduced rules, and there are other companies that have introduced rules about good working conditions and making sure that children are in schools and not working in mines. And also the Fair Cobalt Alliance that was founded to make sure that changes were made for the better. He highlighted specifically that there are cobalt-free lithium ions, which are ethically, they're ethical and long-lasting. And he basically said that there are companies like Tesla, MG, and Maxus that have started using them in the electric buses. But the other thing he pointed out that people don't recognise is that it's used in the refining process for petrol and diesel. We use cobalt in our laptops that we use, in our phones, in so many things in everyday life, but all of this stuff does not get pointed out, does it?
Links to the Fair Cobalt Alliance are in the show notes. I think what we've shown here is that for those people intent on sowing doubt amongst people who don't know, it's very easy to selectively pick facts and present them in a convincing way to try and mislead someone about the dangers, effects, or impact of something. But it's also really, really easy to pick holes in a lot of these arguments and show them for what they are, paltering. But let's talk about the difference between paltering and greenwashing.
There was an example, and it was IKEA. And it was basically talking about, there was in the UK, and a big IKEA, I think it was in the UK, a big IKEA site had actually been built, and it was in inverted commas, sustainable. It's a sustainable IKEA site. This is fantastic. Just look at what we've done. But what they didn't point out was they'd knocked another building down before and then built it on top. So come on, how the heck is that sustainable?
It's not.
So that can be seen as paltering, when really it's just a load of greenwashing nonsense, really, isn't it?
I think, to my mind, the big example, and it's very much on the cusp, is self-charging hybrid. At the end of the day, does it self-charge? If you're thinking about how the regen from the battery charges a small battery in the car, yes, it does. But all of the power, 100% of the power, comes from fossil fuel. So it's not actually self-charging. But that's not paltering, because they're not actually telling the truth to and omitting bits about it. That's just plain greenwashing, and how the Advertising Standards Association in the UK let that go through. But you can't call a battery electric vehicle zero emissions is beyond me. The moral of the story is, don't take anything you're told at face value if it seems to contradict what you think is reasonable. Look at the whole picture and try and educate yourself on what's not being said. So how can we stop paltering?
I mean, it's a bit like the FUD, isn't it? This is all contributing to FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. We know that the Stop Burning Stuff campaign, with a kind of working to try and counter the FUD that's out there, and I think that's got to be the way forward. But to me, it's about the whole of the community that It's partly to do with the fact that we've got to get people to recognise that a lot of this information that we're receiving, you have to question it. I mean, there can't be that. There's lots, thousands of intelligent people out there, and at some point, surely they've got to question this. For example, if you think about, and I don't know what you probably thought I was going to actually bring this up, Kerry, but when we had Rishi Sunak pulling back on the 2030 petrol and diesel ban, and pushing it back to 2035, the whole thing about, him saying, oh, you're not going to have to pay tax on meat because we were going to tax the meat originally. And that wasn't even in their policy. So surely there's got to be people that actually realise, even staunch fans of the government, there's got to be people who kind of go, I didn't see that one. Where was that? Looking through the policy documents, go, I didn't see that anywhere. There's surely that at some point lying gets tripped up. You can I've got to say personally, I can't lie for, you could ask my husband. I could tell little white ones, but I cannot lie for toffee. And, and actually there's so many people who got to recognize that it's just a crock of that word that I don't want to say.
Bovine scatology.
That's a very good, yes. I'm going to have to write that one down and remember it. Thank you.
Even uses the same initials as well. Yeah.
Like stop burning stuff. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's increasing the campaigns. And do you know what? And I know these are the ones the government is actually not helping with some of the, the greenwashing and the lying and the paltering and things like that. So my question is back to you, actually. What do you think the government should be doing in order to support a positive message going out there about, about EVs because surely they've got to recognise how important it is in relation to decarbonisation of transport?
It's a small question with a huge answer. And I don't know whether it's one I actually want to go into specifically at this point on this podcast. But I will say that I think one of the things that we as a population need to be doing is looking at things that we're being told and sort of putting them to the smell test. So if a fossil fuel company comes up to you and says, oh, we're very heavily invested in going renewable, you probably need to smell that and go, well, that doesn't sound right. Yes, you may be telling me things that are true, but overall, it doesn't sound right. So what I need to do then as an individual is try to look behind the scenes. And that links back to our ExxonMobil discussion a few moments ago. Yeah, they're looking at carbon capture, and scientists have said that this is a way forward, etc. They made a number of true statements, but the implication doesn't actually match. They've left us to make the implication. And when you go and look behind the scenes and find out how bad carbon capture actually is in the big scheme of things, that's the way that you can actually look at this and go, right, that's paltering, and I'm calling it out. And I think looping back to your question of a few seconds ago, yes, the government needs to be doing this. But unfortunately, as we know, the government, especially the government that we currently have at the time of recording, is very much a government that is doing that. They're saying the things that people want to hear, which may not necessarily be the actual truth. They're selectively giving little bits of information out that people who have a bias either in favor of one thing or against the other are seizing on and going, yes, that matches my biases, therefore it must be true. I'm not going to look any further into it and find out how much of that is actually paltering. It's a very, very complex topic, I believe.
It is. And I totally get why you don't want to go any further into it, Gary, because I mean, if you look at who we've currently got as our unelected Prime Minister and the biggest conflict of interest with his, with his links to oil and gas, it's not a conversation you can just, have on a shorter podcast. It's one that I'm sure lots of people are as angry as me about it.
Oh, believe me, I'm as angry at it as you are. Just absolutely believe me. Let's just wrap up now. I think the moral of the story is, especially when it comes to some of the aspects of renewables and the energy transition and climate that we've talked about, don't take anything that you're told at face value if it seems to contradict what you think is reasonable, regardless of whether individual pieces of information that you've been given are factually accurate. You've got to look at the whole picture, try to educate yourself on what's not actually being said. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. But it's also about try not to get angry about it, because I can imagine lots of people who when they realise all of this, anger won't do anything. You've actually got to step back and be rational and then call it out. Because I think it's about being rational.
Being rational, precisely. My thanks to Liz for her time and assistance with this discussion. This season, we're looking at raising the awareness of carbon literacy with our listeners. One way we're doing this is with a carbon fact, as read by carbon literacy trainer Anne Snelson.
You might know that cows and sheep produce lots of methane, which is a really potent greenhouse gas. But did you know it's actually their burps that cause the problem? So cut your beef and lamb if you can and swap to healthier nuts, beans and veggies instead.
It's time for a cool EV or renewable thing to share with your listeners. Leasing solar panels. Green energy company Unbound Energy has announced the launch of its solar subscription model, offering homeowners a way in which to utilise solar energy with no upfront costs and generating immediate savings. It's a subscription service that allows you to effectively lease solar panels from about £70 a month. The costs are covered by monetising your solar generation, battery assets, and grid balancing efforts. The lease can save you £500 a year on your bills, which is fantastic. The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers in the UK, which helps EV drivers search, plan, and pay for their charging. ZapMap is free to download and use, with subscription plans for enhanced features such as using ZapMap in-car, on CarPlay, or Android Auto. And that's the show for today. Hope you enjoyed listening to it. If you want to contact me, I can be emailed at evmusings@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at MusingsEV. If you want to support the podcast and newsletter, please consider contributing to becoming an EV Musings patron. The link is in the show notes. Don't want to sign up for something on a monthly basis? If you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/EVmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/EVmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. I have a couple of ebooks out there if you want something to read on your Kindle. So, you've gone electric. It's available on Amazon worldwide for the measly sum of 99p or equivalent, and it's a great little introduction to living with an electric car. So, you've gone renewable is also available on Amazon for the same 99p, and it covers installing solar panels, a storage battery, and a heat pump. Why not check them out? Links for everything we've talked about in the podcast today are in the description. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe. It's available on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave a review as it helps raise visibility and extend our reach in search engines. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you got to this point by tweeting me at MusingsEV with the words Paltering in motion. Hashtag if you know, nothing else. Thanks as always to my co-founder Simon. You know, he likes to think of himself as being a bit of a Call of Duty expert. Loves wading into the campaigns, using the multiplayer option to team up with like-minded players to win at all costs. Well, I say at all costs. He recently shared with me that there's a line he won't cross when it comes to weapons.
I'm a little bit on the fence, Gary, when it comes to nuclear.
Thanks for listening. Bye.